This is episode 3 of Finding Women Artists in Art History, and today I'm going to talk about Edith Heller, a Victorian-era painter who excelled at creating domestic settings and had a remarkable grasp at romanticizing the canvas alongside depicting the subject's psychology. One of the 4 daughters, all artists of James Heller, Edith received her professional training under him and moved on to have a successful career with 2 of her paintings exhibited at the Royal Academy. These frames that she so delicately painted are not only crucial for her artistic identity but also a specimen to analyze the Victorian period through the feminine lens. The figures, majorly women, children motifs and accessories repeat in several of Edith's works and formulate an image that showcases the domestic femininity and the challenges it faced under the social and economic reforms. Though Edith, like her 3 sisters, was an exceptional artist, she had to abandon the art of painting after her marriage. Fortunately, her frames are preserved in a way that we can still admire her talent.